My final memory before dying was snapping steel. A sharp crack, a sudden rush of wind, followed by blackness. Now, I'm staring at that identical rusted carabiner, inhaling familiar stale coffee and cheap hairspray. I'm back on set, where my life ended. Here stands Harper, demanding my spot, demanding that exact stunt, which broke my spine in two. She wants total glory. Fine. I'll hold her coffee while she takes a fatal drop. I didn't gasp when I woke up. There was no cinematic bolt upright, no clutching my chest. There was only the immediate, overwhelming sensation of my legs. They felt heavy. They felt warm. I could feel the tight, synthetic fabric of the cheap costume pants pressing into my calves. I dug my fingernails into my thigh hard enough to leave a crescent moon bruise. Pain blossomed sharp and stinging. I was alive. I wasn't in the hospital bed. I wasn't staring at a textured ceiling tile, listening to the rhythmic, suffocating hiss of a ventilator. Earth to Chloe. You're zoning out again. The voice cut through the ringing in my ears like a serrated knife. I blinked, the harsh fluorescent vanity lights of the makeup trailer searing into my retinas. The smell hit me next, a suffocating mix of burnt hair, aerosol hairspray, and the sour tang of nervous sweat. I looked up at the mirror. Staring back at me was a 22-year-old face, pale, devoid of the hollow gray exhaustion that had settled into my bones during the 3 years I spent paralyzed. My makeup was half done. A thick smudge of artificial dirt streaked across my left cheek. I shifted my gaze in the reflection. Sitting 3 chairs down, getting her cuticles oiled by a nervous production assistant, was Harper. She looked exactly as she had the day my life ended. Her blonde hair was pinned up in meticulous loose waves that were supposed to look effortless, but took 2 hours to achieve. She wore her lead actress status like a heavy, obnoxious perfume. In fact, her actual perfume, sickly sweet vanilla, layered over the smell of imported menthol cigarettes, was already making my stomach churn. I don't get why we're even using a double for the drop. Harper was complaining loudly, to no one in particular, waving her freshly manicured hand. It's a 50-foot rig. Tom Cruise does his own drops. It looks better on camera. The audience can tell when it's a stunt double. It pulls them out of the movie. My breath hitched. The drop. Scene 42. The climax of the film's second act. In my first life, this was the moment I had fought for. I was a hungry, desperate stunt performer, trying to break into the main roster. When Harper had complained about doing the stunt, I had stepped up. I had practically begged the stunt coordinator, Greg, to let me do it. I wanted to prove I was fearless. I got the drop, and the main winch's secondary pin sheared off halfway down. I hit the concrete floor at 40 miles an hour. Harper went on to win an award for her emotional performance in the film, a film dedicated to my memory, in the smallest font possible during the end credits. I slowly stood up from the makeup chair. My knees trembled. The joints felt loose, unsteady, like they didn't quite belong to me anymore. "You good, Chloe?" Ben, the makeup artist, asked, pausing with a powder brush in mid-air. "I'm fine," I said. My voice sounded raspy foreign. "Just need some air." I stepped out of the trailer and into the suffocating July heat. The backlot was a chaotic hive of noise. The guttural hum of diesel generators vibrated through the thin soles of my sneakers. Grips were shouting, dragging thick black cables across the dust like heavy snakes. In the distance, I saw it. The scaffolding, towering 50 feet into the air, a skeletal structure of cold steel and heavy-duty rigging. The safety mats were being dragged into place, looking absurdly thin from this distance. My chest tightened. A cold sweat broke out on the back of my neck, mingling with the heavy humidity. The phantom pain flared in my lower spine, a ghost memory of shattered vertebrae. I closed my eyes, fighting a sudden, violent wave of nausea. I swallowed hard-tasting bile and cheap, craft service coffee. There you are. I turned. Greg, the stunt coordinator, was walking toward me, a heavy climbing harness slung over his thick shoulder. He smelled like leather stale sweat and Old Spice. We're doing the final dry run in 20, Greg said, clapping a heavy hand on my shoulder. You ready to show Harper how it's done? Kid's been whining all morning that she wants to do it herself to get the director's attention. But Davis knows better. We need you on the wire. The words hung in the air. This was the exact moment. The crossroads. In the life before, I had grinned, puffed out my chest, and said I was born ready. I looked at Greg. I looked at the harness. The thick nylon webbing, the heavy metal D-rings, the primary carabiner. It all looked so ordinary, so safe. Actually, Greg, I started my voice barely above a whisper. I cleared my throat, forcing the words out, past the lump of pure terror lodged there. I don't think I can do it. Greg's brow furrowed. The jovial expression melted off his face, replaced by a rigid, professional frown. What do you mean you can't do it? Are you injured? No, I said, looking down at the dirt. I couldn't look him in the eye. I didn't want him to see the cowardice, or worse, the calculation. My head isn't in it. I'm shaking. I can't trust my core right now. If I go up there, I'm going to mess up the landing. Chloe, we shoot in 3 hours. Greg snapped his voice, dropping an octave. You don't get to pull out because you have stage fright. You're a professional. I know, I said flatly. Fire me. But I'm not getting on that wire. Before Greg could lay into me further, the trailer door banged open. Harper stepped out, holding a green juice, flanked by her assistant. She had caught the tail end of the conversation. Her eyes lit up a predatory gleam, flashing in her irises. Is there a problem, Greg? Harper asked, her voice dripping with faux concern. She walked over her heavy combat boots, crunching loudly against the gravel. She looked me up and down, her lips curling into a microscopic sneer. Is the stunt too scary for the professional? Greg sighed, rubbing the bridge of his nose. Chloe's backing out. Says she doesn't feel safe. Harper laughed. A short, sharp sound that felt like a slap. Unbelievable. You stunt girls talk a big game until it's time to actually work. Whatever. She turned her gaze to Greg, her posture shifting, her shoulders pulling back. She was turning on the leading lady charm. Put me in, Greg. I told you I wanted to do it anyway. Davis is going to love the authenticity. No cuts, no hidden faces. Just me doing the work. Greg hesitated. Harper, it's a high-velocity drop. It's not a standard wire pull. It jerks you hard at the bottom. I do Pilates 5 days a week, Greg. I think I can handle a little jerk, she said dismissively. She reached out and grabbed the heavy harness from his shoulder. Go tell Davis I'm doing the drop. Let this one. She waved a hand, vaguely in my direction, without looking at me. Go get a coffee or something. I didn't say anything. I just stood there, feeling the hot sun beating down on my face. My heart was hammering against my ribs, a frantic trapped bird. I wasn't a hero. I wasn't stepping back to let karma take the wheel, because I was some righteous avenger. I was stepping back because I was terrified. But as I watched Harper strut away, the heavy harness dragging slightly in the dirt behind her, a small, dark, ugly part of my soul uncoiled. Take it. I thought the metallic tang of blood in my mouth from biting the inside of my cheek. Take the glory. It's all yours. The next 2 days were a blur of technical rehearsals and camera blocking. Being demoted from Harper's primary stunt, double to a glorified stand-in, meant I spent hours standing on pieces of neon gaffer tape while the lighting department adjusted their rigs. It was agonizing, not physically, but mentally. Every time I had to stand under the massive rig, the hairs on my arms stood up. I couldn't stop looking up at the crisscrossing steel bars, the heavy winches, the thick black cables. To everyone else, it was just movie magic. To me, it was a guillotine waiting to drop. Harper, meanwhile, was thriving on the attention. She had made sure everyone on set knew she was doing her own stunt. She talked about it at the catering table, picking at a pathetic pile of arugula. She talked about it in the makeup chair. She talked about it loudly on her phone, making sure to drop phrases like dedication to the craft and pushing my physical limits. She's unbearable. A grip muttered to me as we stood by the craft service table, both of us watching Harper complain to a PA that her iced latte was too watery. I took a bite of a stale powdered donut. The sugar coated the roof of my mouth gritty and dry. She's dedicated, I replied, my voice completely devoid of inflection. The grip snorted and walked away. I threw the rest of the donut in the trash. I couldn't eat. I hadn't slept more than 2 hours a night since waking up in the makeup trailer. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt the sickening sensation of free fall. I heard the snap. I felt the concrete shatter my pelvis. I wiped the powdered sugar off my jeans and walked over to the staging area. The stunt team had set up a heavy folding table covered in gear. Piles of carabiners, harnesses, ascenders, and spools of static line. The smell of WD-40 industrial grease and canvas was thick in the air. Greg was off in the distance, arguing with Davis, the director, about camera angles. No one was watching the table. I walked over. My boots felt heavy, like I was moving underwater. I didn't want to look, but I had to. I needed to know if I was crazy. If the first life had just been a terrible, hyper-realistic nightmare. My fingers hovered over a row of heavy-duty O-rings and quick-release pins. These were the components that would connect Harper's harness to the main drop line. I picked up the primary quick-release pin. It was heavy, cold metal. It was covered in a thin film of machine oil. I wiped it clean with the hem of my shirt and held it up to the harsh glare of a nearby production light. I squinted, rotating the metal slowly. There it was, just beneath the head of the pin, barely visible to the naked eye, was a hairline fracture. It looked like a tiny, insignificant scratch in the finish. But I knew what it was. It was a structural failure waiting for a dynamic load. When the winch braked at the bottom of the drop, the sudden force of a human body coming to a dead stop would put thousands of pounds of pressure on this exact point. The metal wouldn't hold. It would shear right off. My breath caught in my throat. I stood frozen, staring at the tiny silver crack. My thumb traced over it. The metal was smooth, but beneath it, the integrity was rotten. I should tell Greg, a voice in my head whispered. It was a weak, pathetic voice. The voice of the girl who used to believe in doing the right thing. It's right here. Just show him. They swap the pin, and Harper lives. She gets the glory, she remains unbearable, but she walks away. I squeeze the pin so hard the metal bit into the flesh of my palm. If I told them, I'd save her. But Harper hadn't saved me. When I was lying in the hospital, My career destroyed, my body a broken cage. Harper hadn't visited. She had given one tearful interview about how traumatic it was for her to witness the accident, and then she moved on to shoot a Marvel movie. She took my tragedy and wore it like a vintage accessory to make herself look deep. "What are you doing with the gear?" I jumped, nearly dropping the heavy pin. Harper was standing a few feet away, her arms crossed over her chest. She was already strapped into the lower half of her harness. The thick nylon straps dug into her thighs. She looked annoyed, her perfectly sculpted eyebrows drawn together. "Just looking," I said, my voice surprisingly steady. I carefully set the pin back down on the table, exactly where I had found it. Harper scoffed, stepping closer. She smelled like mint breath spray and arrogance. "You know it's really pathetic, hovering around the gear like a sad puppy. You made your choice, Chloe. You chickened out. Don't try to sabotage my rig just because you're jealous." A cold, heavy silence settled between us. The ambient noise of the set seemed to fade into a dull hum. I looked at her. I looked past the perfect makeup, the expensive hair, the sheer, blinding entitlement. I saw a fragile ego wrapped in a human body, about to be strapped to a faulty piece of metal. The moral nausea vanished. The guilt evaporated, replaced by a cold, hard clarity that settled into my bones like winter frost. "I'm not jealous, Harper," I said softly. I didn't blink. I just stared into her eyes. "I just want to make sure everything is exactly as it should be." She rolled her eyes, completely missing the deadness in my tone. "Whatever. Just stay out of the way. When I'm up there tonight, I need total focus. I don't need my ex double pouting in my eyeline." "Don't worry," I said, taking a step back. I let a small, ugly smile touch the corners of my mouth. I wouldn't miss this for the world. The night shoot was miserable. The rain machines were working overtime, blasting thousands of gallons of freezing water into the air, turning the backlot dirt into a thick, slick soup of mud. The harsh, blue-tinted production lights cut through the artificial downpour, creating long, jagged shadows across the set. I stood behind the video village, the cluster of monitors where Davis and the producers sat holding umbrellas and drinking hot tea. I was wearing a thick, waterproof parka, my hands shoved deep into the pockets, clutching a heat pack until my knuckles ached. "All right, let's get her hooked up." Davis's voice boomed over the megaphone, cutting through the drumming sound of the fake rain. Out on the set, Harper was standing on her mark. She was shivering, her thin costume soaked through, clinging to her skin. Her hair was plastered to her skull. She looked miserable, but as the camera swung toward her, she forced her jaw to relax, striking a defiant pose. Greg and his team moved in. They worked quickly, efficiently. I watched as Greg clipped the heavy carabiners to the D-rings at Harper's waist and between her shoulder blades. He reached into his pouch. He pulled out the primary quick-release pin. My heart slammed against my ribs. A sickening rhythm. Thump, thump, thump. I watched as Greg slid the pin into the block. I heard the sharp, metallic clack as it locked into place. He tugged it twice to make sure it was seated. It held. Of course it held. It could hold static weight all day. "Lock it off," Greg yelled over the rain. The winch operator gave a thumbs up from the scaffolding. The wire pulled taut. Harper was suddenly jerked 2 feet into the air. She let out a small, unscripted squeak of surprise before composing herself. She dangled there in the freezing rain, suspended by a thread of steel and a fractured pin. "Okay, take her up." Davis shouted. The winch ground to life, a high-pitched, whining mechanical sound that made my teeth ache. Harper began to rise. 10 feet, 20 feet, 30 feet. The higher she went, the smaller she looked. The bravado, the arrogance, it all stripped away, leaving just a tiny human figure suspended in the dark, artificial storm. I couldn't look away. My eyes were wide, burning in the cold wind. My mouth was dry. The internal contradiction was tearing me apart. Part of me, the human part, the part that remembered the agony of a shattered spine, was screaming. Stop it. Yell cut. Run out there. Stop the winch. But my legs wouldn't move. They felt rooted to the mud. The memory of the hospital room. The smell of antiseptic. The realization that I would never walk properly again anchored me in place. She had taken my life, not with malice, but with a casual, devastating indifference. She had stepped over my broken body to get to the spotlight. Now she was in it. She's at 50 feet, the first AD called out. Camera rolling. Speed. Harper dangled at the very top of the rig. She looked like a broken marionette, waiting for the puppeteer. I could see her chest heaving, even from this distance. She was terrified. She was finally realizing what 50 feet actually looked like, when there was nothing between you and the concrete but a wire. I bit my lip so hard, I tasted copper, warm blood mixed with the freezing rain on my face. Stand by, on the drop, Davis said quietly, leaning into his microphone. The winch operator put his hand on the release lever. The set went dead silent. The only sound was the hissing of the rain machines and the low, guttural hum of the generators. Everyone was watching. Everyone was holding their breath. I pulled my hands out of my pockets. My fingers were shaking violently. I took one step forward, opening my mouth. A sound started in my throat, a ragged, pathetic gasp. Action! Davis roared. The winch operator yanked the lever. The brake disengaged. The wire screamed as it fed through the pulleys, and Harper fell. Gravity doesn't negotiate. It doesn't care about box office draw or how many followers you have on Instagram or how much Pilates you do. Gravity is a mathematical certainty. Harper fell. For the first 30 feet, it looked exactly as it was supposed to, a controlled, high-speed descent. The thin steel cable unspooled from the winch with a high-pitched, screaming whine that cut right through the hiss of the rain machines. In the harsh glare of the production lights, she was a pale blur plunging toward the muddy earth. I watched her arms flail, breaking the aerodynamic tuck Greg had taught her. She was panicking. Then the brake engaged. The winch mechanism slammed shut exactly 20 feet above the ground, designed to decelerate the falling body into a smooth, dramatic hover, just inches above the concrete floor. The physics of it were simple: a sudden, violent transfer of kinetic energy from the falling object to the static rigging. I didn't blink. I couldn't. I watched the tension hit the wire. The sound it made wasn't a snap. It was a detonation. Crack. It sounded like a high-caliber rifle firing in a tiled bathroom. The noise echoed off the aluminum siding of the sound stages, sharp enough to make the first AD flinch and drop his clipboard. Up on the wire, the fractured quick-release pin finally gave way. The metal sheared cleanly under the massive dynamic load, instantly severing the connection between the primary drop line and Harper's harness. For a fraction of a second, she just hung there, suspended in midair, entirely by her own upward momentum, a trick of the eye. And then The remaining 20 feet belonged entirely to gravity. She dropped like a stone. The safety mats beneath the rig were designed for a performer who was already decelerating, not a dead-weight freefall from a 2-story building. When Harper hit them, there was no bounce. There was only a sickening, wet thud. It was a heavy, dense sound, the sound of a sack of wet flour hitting a marble floor. It vibrated through the mud, traveling through the soles of my boots, and straight up into my own perfectly intact spine. Silence. It wasn't a true silence, because the generators were still roaring, and the fake rain was still pouring from the overhead rigs, but the human element of the set ceased to exist. Every grip, every PA, every camera operator froze, trapped in amber. Then the screaming started. "Cut, cut! Get a medic! Jesus Christ! Get a medic out here!" Davis, the director, was out of his canvas chair, slipping in the mud as he sprinted past the monitors. The set exploded into absolute chaos. Walkie-talkies erupted in a cacophony of static and panicked voices. The lighting crew violently swung the massive 10K lamps down from the scaffolding, spotlighting the safety mats in a blinding surgical white glare. I didn't move. I stood exactly where I was, the freezing artificial rain soaking through my parka, matting my hair to my forehead. Greg was the first one to reach her. He dove onto the slick, wet vinyl of the crash mat, his heavy hands hovering over Harper's body, terrified. To touch her, terrified. To move her neck. "Harper, Harper, don't move. Do not move a muscle." Greg was shouting, his voice cracking with a raw, unfiltered terror that I had never heard from him before. "Where the hell is Set Medical? Get the bags." I slowly walked forward. My legs felt hollow, like dry reeds, but they moved. I stepped out from behind the video village and walked toward the blinding lights. People were shoving past me, screaming for blankets, screaming for an ambulance. I was a ghost, drifting through a war zone. I reached the edge of the crash mat. Harper was lying on her side, twisted at an angle that defied the natural architecture of the human body. Her left leg was bent inward, the knee pointing toward her opposing hip. Her eyes were wide open, dilated, staring blindly into the harsh production lights. The fake blood from her makeup had washed away in the rain, but a thin, dark stream of real blood was leaking from her nose, pooling in the muddy water beside her cheek. She wasn't screaming. She wasn't crying. She was just making a low, rhythmic, wet, rasping sound at the back of her throat. Air my brain supplied automatically. She's struggling to get air into her lungs because the impact paralyzed her diaphragm. I knew that sound. I had made that sound. 3 years ago in a life that now felt like a fever dream, I had laid on that exact same mat, staring at those exact same lights, making that exact same wet, gasping noise, while Harper sat in her trailer, complaining about the delay. I stared down at her. The cold rain dripped off my eyelashes. I waited for the guilt. I waited for the crushing, suffocating weight of my own complicity to drive me to my knees. I waited to feel like a monster, but I didn't. Instead, a strange, terrible warmth spread through my chest. It was the feeling of a heavy ledger snapping shut. The accounts were balanced. The universe had righted itself, not through divine intervention, but through a rusted piece of steel in my own silence. "Move everybody back up." 2 set medics barreled through the crowd, carrying heavy orange trauma bags and a hard plastic backboard. They shoved me aside. I stumbled backward into the mud landing hard on my palms. The gritty, freezing dirt scraped my skin. I looked at my hands. They were covered in mud, but they were working. My fingers curled into fists. I could feel the cold. I could feel the pain. I was whole. As they strapped a cervical collar around Harper's neck, the wail of distant sirens finally breached the gates of the studio backlot. I slowly stood up, brushing the mud off my jeans, and walked away from the lights disappearing back into the dark. Hospitals have a specific architecture of despair. It isn't just the visual of fluorescent lights and seafoam green walls. It's the texture of the air. It's the suffocating, overlapping smells of floor wax, industrial bleach, rubbing alcohol, and old coffee that has been sitting on a hot plate for 12 hours. It was 48 hours after the drop. I was sitting in a stiff plastic waiting room chair on the surgical ICU floor of Cedars-Sinai. The vinyl seat was warm and sticky. I had nowhere else to be. The studio had shut down production indefinitely. We were all on paid standby ghosts, waiting for a movie that might never resume. I shouldn't have come. It was masochistic, but a dark magnetic pull had dragged me here. I needed to see the aftermath. I needed to know if the script had truly flipped. Down the hall, past the double doors that required badge access, Harper was lying in a bed wired to monitors that beeped in a steady, monotonous rhythm. The official word hadn't been released to the press yet, but the whispers in the Stunt department group chat were grim. Shattered L4 and L5 vertebrae. Massive spinal cord trauma. I dug my thumbnail into the skin of my wrist, feeling the sharp, grounding pinch. It's a complete disaster, Fiona. The insurance company is already threatening to pull our completion bond. The voice came from the corridor, just out of sight. I recognized the frantic, strained tenor immediately. It was Davis, the director. I leaned forward, keeping my head down, hiding behind a dog-eared copy of a year-old lifestyle magazine. Footsteps approached. The sharp, rapid click-clack of expensive heels on linoleum. Fiona, the studio's crisis PR manager. She smelled like expensive dry cleaning and dry shampoo. She stepped into the waiting area, holding a sleek tablet, with Davis pacing nervously behind her. They didn't even glance in my direction. To them, a stunt girl in a gray hoodie was just a piece of waiting room furniture. We need to control the narrative before TMZ gets a hold of a crew member, Fiona said. Her voice was ice-cold, completely devoid of empathy. She was operating in pure crisis mode. We spin it as a tragic accident born from her dedication to the craft. Harper wanted to deliver an authentic performance for her fans. She pushed the limits of practical filmmaking. Fiona, she might never walk again, Davis hissed, rubbing his face with both hands. He looked haggard, a heavy shadow of stubble on his jaw. Her agent is going to sue the studio into the Stone Age. Greg is already lawyering up. Let the lawyers handle the lawsuits. Fiona snapped, tapping her stylus against the tablet. I'm handling the optics. And right now, the optics are that our lead actress is a martyr for cinema. It's morbid, Davis, but it's going to build massive anticipation for the film. If we recast and finish the picture, we dedicate it to her. We make it a tribute. The Academy eats that up. My stomach turned. A wave of pure, concentrated nausea washed over me. I slowly lowered the magazine. I looked at Davis, the man who had screamed for a medic, the man who had looked so devastated on the mud-soaked set. Now, 48 hours later, he wasn't mourning the loss of a young woman's mobility. He was mourning his shooting schedule. He was calculating how to leverage her broken spine into an Oscar campaign. It was the exact same thing they had done to me. In my previous life, when I was the one screaming on the mat, there had been no Fiona. There had been no crisis. PR for Chloe the stunt girl. I was just a liability, a line item on an insurance claim. They had recast my role with another desperate girl, finished the film, and put my name in size 10 font at the end of the credits, right between the caterer and the transportation captain. Harper was getting the premium treatment, the martyr treatment. But underneath the expensive PR spin, the reality was exactly the same. The machine didn't care about her. The machine only cared about the product. Harper was meat for the grinder, just like I was. Fiona stopped tapping her tablet and looked at Davis. We need to throw someone under the bus, Davis. Publicly. And fast. The narrative needs a villain, so it isn't the studio. Greg, Davis said instantly. He didn't even hesitate. He's the stunt coordinator. He rigged the wire. It's his department. The buck stops with him. Good, Fiona said, making a note. I'll leak it to Deadline anonymously tonight. Negligence in the stunt department leads to catastrophic failure. That shifts the liability off the production company and onto his independent contracting firm. I squeezed the magazine so hard the glossy pages tore. Greg was a loud, abrasive, old-school stunt guy who smelled like Old Spice and yelled too much. But he was meticulous. He checked his lines. He checked his harnesses. The only reason that Pin failed was because it was microscopic, a hairline fracture buried under machine oil. It was an act of God, or more accurately, an act of extreme negligence by the manufacturer. But I had seen it. I had held the pin in my hand. I had wiped the grease away, and I had seen the fracture. If I had spoken up, Greg wouldn't be facing the destruction of his career bankruptcy and public crucifixion. He had a wife. He had 2 kids in college. The industry would blacklist him. They would ruin him to protect their profit margins. Davis and Fiona walked away, their voices dropping back into hushed, conspiratorial whispers as they headed toward the elevators. I sat alone in the waiting room. The silence was deafening, broken only by the hum of the fluorescent lights, the feeling of victory. That dark, twisted warmth I had felt on the set evaporated completely. It was replaced by a cold, hollow dread. I had wanted Harper to pay. I had wanted her to feel the exact physical agony she had so casually stepped over to get her trophy. But I hadn't accounted for the blast radius. I hadn't realized that when you let a bomb go off, it doesn't just kill your target. It takes out everything in the room. I stood up. My joints popped. I walked to the trash can and threw the torn magazine inside. The smell of iodine suddenly felt so thick in the back of my throat, I thought I was going to choke on it. I walked out of the hospital into the blinding Los Angeles smog, carrying a weight that was far heavier than a broken spine. I was whole, but I was rotten. The production office on the studio lot was freezing. The air conditioning was cranked so high, the vents in the ceiling rattled. The room smelled of burnt coffee grounds, ozone from overheated photocopiers, and the sour, distinct odor of nervous sweat. I sat at a long, faux mahogany conference table. The veneer was peeling at the edges. Across from me sat Mr. Caldwell. He was an investigator for the studio's insurance underwriter. He wore a gray suit that was a little too tight across the shoulders and wire-rimmed glasses that caught the harsh overhead light masking his eyes. He had a thick manila folder open in front of him, filled with black and white photographs of the accident site. Piles of sheared metal, muddy carabiners in the blood-stained safety mat. To my left sat Greg. I barely recognized him. He looked like he had aged 10 years in 3 days. His usually ruddy complexion was a sallow, ashen gray. The jovial, booming confidence that defined him was entirely gone. His shoulders were slumped, his massive hands clasped tightly together on the table in front of him. He hadn't looked at me since I walked into the room. He just kept staring at the photograph of the broken quick-release pin. "Let's go over the timeline again, Chloe," Caldwell said. His voice was smooth, flat and entirely devoid of emotion. It was the voice of a man who calculated human tragedy in dollars and cents. "You were originally scheduled to perform the wire drop. Is that correct?" "Yes," I said. My voice was steady, but my throat was dry. I kept my hands out of sight, folded tightly in my lap, digging my nails into my palms to stop them from shaking. "And yet, 2 hours before the shoot you pulled out." Caldwell flipped a page in his folder. He looked up, peering at me over the rim of his glasses. "Can you explain why?" This was it. The precipice. I could tell the truth. I could say I pulled out because I touched the primary drop pin and saw a hairline fracture. I pulled out because I knew it was going to break, and I hated Harper enough to let her take the fall. If I said that, I would go to prison for criminal negligence, maybe manslaughter if she died from complications. But Greg would be cleared. The studio wouldn't be able to pin it on him. I looked at Greg. He finally slowly turned his head to look at me. His eyes were bloodshot, rimmed with dark, bruised exhaustion. There was no anger in his gaze. There was only a desperate, pleading confusion. He was a man drowning, looking for a piece of driftwood. "I pulled out because I lost my nerve," I said. The words tasted like ash in my mouth. Greg's shoulders sagged even further. He looked away, staring back at the table. "You lost your nerve," Caldwell repeated, writing something down on a yellow legal pad. "You are a professional stunt performer. You have done wire work before. And yet, on this specific night, on this specific rig, you suddenly got scared." "It's not a math equation, Mr. Caldwell," I said, forcing a defensive edge into my voice. I leaned forward, channeling the fear in my gut into righteous indignation. "It's a 50-foot drop in the freezing rain." My core felt loose. I was shivering. If a stunt performer doesn't feel 100% confident, they don't do the gag. It's the first rule of the job. If I had gone up there distracted, I could have broken my neck on the landing. The bitter irony of my own words almost made me gag. "I see." Caldwell tapped his pen against the table. "And during your time around the staging area that afternoon, did you inspect the gear?" "No." I lied smoothly. My heart beat a steady rhythmic drum in my ears. I was crossing a line, stepping fully into the dark. I wasn't doing the stunt anymore. The gear wasn't my responsibility. "Greg," Caldwell said, turning his attention to the stunt coordinator. His tone sharpened, adopting a prosecutorial edge. "You logged a visual and physical inspection of the rigging at 4 p.m. You signed off on all load-bearing elements, including the primary quick-release pin. The same pin that sheared in half." Greg swallowed hard. His Adam's apple bobbed in his throat. "I checked it. I swear to God I checked it. I wiped it down. I tested the spring mechanism. I tapped it for hollows. It was solid. It must have been a microfracture inside the alloy. Something you can't see without an X-ray or a magnetic particle test. But it's your job to ensure the safety of the performer, is it not?" Caldwell pressed relentlessly. "Harper is currently in a spinal halo, paralyzed from the waist down. The studio is looking at a $60 million liability claim, and your signature is the only one on the safety manifest. It was a mechanical failure." Greg slammed his fist on the table. It was a weak, pathetic strike. The fight was bleeding out of him. "I didn't break that pin. You want to blame someone, blame the manufacturer in Taiwan. We will be looking into the manufacturer," Caldwell said coldly. But right now, the preliminary findings point to a failure in on-set safety protocols. We believe the pin was visibly stressed before the drop, and you failed to catch it. No, Greg whispered, burying his face in his hands. No, I wouldn't miss that. I wouldn't. I watched him break. I sat 3 feet away, possessing the exact information that could save his sanity, if not his career. I could tell Caldwell that the fracture was barely the size of a human hair hidden beneath the lip of the locking mechanism. I could tell him that nobody doing a standard visual sweep on a muddy, chaotic set would have seen it unless they were looking for it. But I didn't. I remained silent. I let the silence stretch out, filling the freezing room, suffocating Greg. That will be all for now, Chloe, Caldwell said, closing his folder. We have your statement. Do not leave the state. We may need to speak with you again. I stood up. My chair scraped loudly against the linoleum. I looked at Greg one last time. He didn't look up. He was crying, silent heaving sobs that shook his broad shoulders. I walked out of the production office and into the bright, blinding California sun. The heat hit me instantly, but it didn't penetrate the cold, settling deep into my bones. I had survived the drop. I had survived the aftermath. I had my legs, my mobility, and my life. But as I walked across the empty studio lot, listening to the crunch of gravel beneath my boots, I realized the absolute terrifying truth. I hadn't just watched the villain fall. I had taken her place. I started running. Not metaphorically. Literally running. Every morning, before the smog fully settled over the San Fernando Valley, I laced up a pair of heavy-soled trainers and hit the pavement. I ran until the LA heat baked the asphalt, sending shimmering waves of distortion radiating up from the streets. I ran until my lungs burned with the taste of exhaust and dried eucalyptus. I ran until the muscles in my thighs screamed, until the tendons in my knees throbbed with a dull, rhythmic ache. I needed to feel the pain to prove the machinery still worked. I needed the violent, repetitive shock of my heels striking the concrete to convince myself that I wasn't still trapped in that hospital bed from my first life. It had been 7 months since the drop. The movie Shattered Glass premiered in late November. I didn't get an invite to the TCL Chinese Theater, naturally. I watched the red carpet live stream on my laptop, sitting on the floor of my cramped apartment, eating cold pad thai, straight from the cardboard carton. Fiona, the crisis PR manager, had executed her playbook flawlessly. The premiere wasn't a movie release. It was a vigil. The leading men wore somber black suits with small, tasteful silver pins in the shape of a ribbon. Davis, the director, gave a tearful interview to E! News on the carpet, talking about how the film was a testament to the indomitable human spirit. And then there was Harper. They didn't hide her away. They weaponized her. She arrived in a custom-built, motorized wheelchair, flanked by a phalanx of handlers. She was dressed in a stunning sweeping couture gown that carefully draped over the lifeless, dead weight of her legs. Her blonde hair was styled perfectly, but her face was different. The sharp, predatory edge of her jawline was softened by a layer of pale, medication-induced puffiness. The cameras flashed a relentless strobe light of exploitation, and Harper smiled. It was a fragile, practiced smile. I closed the laptop midstream. The silence in my apartment rushed back and thick and suffocating. I had my legs. I had my career. Theoretically. In reality, I was functionally blacklisted by my own trauma. 2 weeks after the premiere, my agent booked me a gig on a mid-budget car commercial. It was a simple gag. a low-altitude wire pull to simulate being thrown backward by an explosion. 10 feet off the ground, a controlled descent onto a massive inflatable airbag. Child's play. I had shown up to the set. I had let the wardrobe department fit me for the harness. But the moment the rigger clipped the carabiner to my D-ring, a violent physical revulsion hijacked my nervous system. My vision tunneled. The smell of the industrial grease on the winch hit the back of my throat, and I immediately threw up my morning coffee onto the concrete floor of the soundstage. I couldn't do it. My body was intact, but my brain was irrevocably shattered. I walked off the set and didn't answer my agent's calls for a week. Instead, I obsessively tracked the fallout. I became a digital voyeur to the destruction I had allowed. Greg's independent contracting firm folded in December. The studio's lawyers had buried him under an avalanche of liability lawsuits. The stunt community, a tight-knit brotherhood, built entirely on trust and reputation, excommunicated him overnight. No one would hire a coordinator who had dropped a leading lady. I found a GoFundMe page set up by his daughter to help cover their legal fees and save their house from foreclosure. The goal was $200,000. They had raised $4,000. I stared at the glowing screen, my thumb hovering over the trackpad. I typed in a donation for $2,000, almost everything I had in my checking account. I clicked the button to make it anonymous. When the transaction cleared, I waited for the catharsis. I waited to feel like I had balanced the scales. Just a little bit. Nothing happened. The guilt didn't recede. It just mutated, curling tighter around my ribs. It was a pathetic, insulting gesture. $2,000 anonymous dollars to apologize for standing in a freezing room and lying while a good man's life was systematically dismantled. I pushed away from the desk, the legs of the chair scraping harshly against the cheap laminate flooring. I walked into the bathroom and stared at myself in the mirror under the harsh, buzzing fluorescent bulb. My eyes were dark, hollowed out by insomnia. The skin around my mouth was pulled tight, set in a permanent grim line. I had survived. I had cheated death, cheated destiny, and successfully transferred my tragedy onto someone else. I turned on the faucet and let the cold water run over my hands, watching it swirl down the drain. I was a ghost, haunting my own life. I had to see her. I had to look at the physical reality of what I had done. The Coastal Pines Rehabilitation Center sat on a jagged cliff in Malibu, overlooking the sprawling, indifferent expanse of the Pacific Ocean. It didn't look like a hospital. It looked like a luxury resort for the terminally depressed. The driveway was lined with imported palm trees, and the air smelled heavily of sea salt lavender air freshener and the sharp underlying tang of clinical sterility. Getting in wasn't hard. I wasn't press, and my name wasn't flagged. I simply told the woman at the front desk I was an old colleague dropping off some letters from the crew. She gave me a sympathetic, tight-lipped smile, slapped a yellow visitor badge on my chest, and pointed me toward the West Wing. The floors were thick, sound-dampening carpet. It absorbed my footsteps, making the hallway feel like a vacuum. Every door I passed offered a glimpse into an expensive, quiet tragedy. I found Harper in the sunroom at the end of the hall. The room was circular, surrounded by floor-to-ceiling glass that let in the blinding midday sun. The ocean glittered aggressively below. Harper was parked in her chair, facing the glass, her back to the door. She was alone. I stood in the doorway. My hands were slick with sweat. The fabric of my jeans felt suddenly abrasive against my skin. I couldn't move. Every instinct I possessed screamed at me to turn around, to walk back out to my car, to drive away, and never look back. But I stepped forward. My sneaker squeaked faintly on a rare patch of exposed linoleum near the threshold. The motorized chair whirred softly as Harper manipulated the joystick, turning to face the sound. The breath caught in my throat, lodged behind a lump of pure, heavy dread. She was wearing loose cashmere sweatpants and an oversized gray sweater that swallowed her frame. The muscular-toned physique she used to flaunt on set was completely gone, cannibalized by months of bed rest and nerve damage. Her legs, hidden beneath the soft wool, looked thin and frail. Her hands rested in her lap, the fingers slightly curled inward. She looked at me. It took a few seconds for the heavy dose of gabapentin and muscle relaxers to clear enough for recognition to register in her eyes. When it did, she didn't scowl. She didn't sneer. Chloe. Her voice was thin, reedy. The demanding theatrical resonance that used to echo across the backlot was entirely stripped away. "Hi, Harper," I said. My voice sounded foreign to me. Flat, hollow. I took a few steps into the room, stopping 10 feet away from her chair. We stared at each other. The silence stretched thick and suffocating, broken only by the rhythmic mechanical whoosh of the central air conditioning. "Did Fiona send you for a photo op?" Harper asked, a faint ghost-like imitation of her old bitterness creeping into the words. She tried to shift her weight in the chair, a subtle movement of her shoulders that resulted in a sharp wince. "No," I said, putting my hands in my pockets to hide their violent shaking. "No one knows I'm here. I wanted to see how you were." Harper let out a dry, rasping chuckle that ended in a cough. "I'm great. I have a team of physical therapists who charge $1,000 an hour to move my legs for me so the muscles don't completely necrotize. And I have a catheter. It's really glamorous. Very Hollywood." I swallowed hard. The sensory memory of the catheter, the humiliating burning indignity of it, flashed behind my eyes. I knew exactly what she was feeling. I knew the specific agonizing timeline of her grief. Right now, she was in the sarcastic phase. It was the armor you wore before the crushing, weeping reality of permanence fully set in. "I'm sorry," I whispered. It was a pathetic, useless phrase. A drop of water in an ocean of grief. Harper looked away from me, turning her gaze back to the blinding glare of the ocean outside the window. "You know what the worst part is?" she asked quietly. "It isn't the legs. I mean, the legs are a nightmare. But the worst part is the phantom pain. Sometimes, usually at night, I swear, I can feel my toes. I can feel the sheets against my skin. My brain tells me that if I just push hard enough, if I just focus, I can stand up." She swallowed, her pale throat working. "And for a split second I believe it. And then I try. And there's just nothing. It's like a brick wall between my brain and my waist. It breaks my heart all over again every single night." My chest tightened until I thought my ribs would snap. I had lived that exact nightmare. I had laid in the dark crying until I vomited, begging a God I didn't believe in for just one twitch of a toe. I had watched her steal my life, and in return, I had condemned her to my personal hell. "I shouldn't have done it," Harper said. Her voice broke, shattering the quiet of the sunroom. My head snapped up. "What?" She slowly turned her chair back toward me. Her eyes were shining, rimmed with red. The arrogance was dead buried under layers of unspeakable physical trauma. "The drop," she whispered. A single tear spilled over her lower lid, cutting a wet track down her pale cheek. I was so stupid, Chloe. I was so arrogant. I saw you back out, and I just wanted to prove I was better than you. I wanted Davis to think I was fearless. I didn't even know how the harness worked. I just let Greg strap me in like a piece of meat. She let out a shuddering breath. I used to think you were weak for getting scared that day. But you were right. You listened to your gut. You knew something felt wrong, and you stepped away. I wish to God I had been weak like you. The room tilted. A violent rushing sound filled my ears like the roar of a jet engine. The floor seemed to drop out from beneath me. She didn't know. She thought my cowardice was intuition. She thought my silence was wisdom. She was sitting in a 200-pound, motorized cage, blaming her own arrogance, completely oblivious to the fact that I had stood by and willingly let her die to satisfy my own petty vengeance. I had wanted to feel justified. I had wanted to look at her and see the monster who had ruined my first life, to confirm that she deserved this. But I didn't see a monster. I just saw a 24-year-old girl who made a stupid, ego-driven mistake and paid for it with the rest of her natural life. Harper, I choked out. The truth was sitting right on my tongue. The confession, the release valve for the crushing pressure in my chest. I knew. I saw the crack. I let you fall. I looked at her frail hands. I looked at the way her sweater hung off her atrophied shoulders. If I told her, I would shatter whatever fragile piece she was trying to build. And more importantly, I would destroy myself. I would go to prison. I would lose the legs I had sacrificed her to keep. The cowardice that had kept me quiet in the production office rose up again, a cold, familiar shield. You aren't weak. I managed to say the lie, burning my throat like battery acid. It was a freak accident. It wasn't your fault. Harper closed her eyes, leaning her head back against the heavy headrest of the chair. Yeah, she breathed out. A freak accident. I couldn't stay a second longer. The air in the room was toxic. I turned on my heel and walked out, my sneakers squeaking against the linoleum, a harsh, frantic sound echoing down the silent carpeted hallway. I made it to the parking lot before my stomach violently rejected the nothingness inside it. I fell to my knees in the pristine, imported gravel next to my rusted sedan. I retched, coughing up bitter yellow bile into a patch of perfectly manicured ice plant. The midday sun beat down on the back of my neck, hot and heavy. I wiped my mouth with the back of my trembling hand, spitting the sour taste into the dirt. I stayed on my knees for a long time, feeling the sharp, jagged edges of the gravel digging into my kneecaps. It hurt. It was a sharp, localized, beautiful pain. I reached down and gripped my own thigh, digging my fingers into the muscle until I bruised the skin. I was whole. The machinery was intact. I could stand up right now, walk to my car, press my foot against the gas pedal, and drive away. But the victory was entirely hollow. When I woke up in that makeup trailer 7 months ago, I thought the universe had handed me a miracle, a cosmic redo, a chance to step off the track before the train hit me. But karma isn't a scale that balances perfectly. It's a meat grinder. And I hadn't broken the machine. I had just pushed someone else into the gears so I could step back. I slowly stood up, brushing the dirt off my jeans. The ocean breeze blew across the parking lot, chilling the cold sweat on my forehead. I unlocked my car and slid into the driver's seat. The vinyl was scorching hot against the back of my legs. I put the key in the ignition, but I didn't turn it. I just gripped the steering wheel, the textured plastic rough under my palms. I thought about Greg, boxing up his house, his career destroyed, carrying the weight of a failure that wasn't his. I thought about Harper, sitting in that glass room, staring at the ocean, dreaming of phantom toes, and punishing herself for my crime. And then I thought about myself. There would be no cinematic redemption arc for me. I wasn't going to march into the police station and confess. I wasn't going to clear Greg's name. I wasn't going to give Harper the closure of knowing she was the victim of a homicide attempt, rather than her own hubris. I was too selfish for that. I loved walking too much. I loved the feeling of my own legs too much to trade them for a clear conscience. I was going to keep my secret. I was going to carry it in the dark, an anchor wrapped in barbed wire, dragging behind me for the rest of my life. I had won the game. I had survived the drop. But as I stared out the windshield at the vast, indifferent Pacific Ocean, feeling the steady rhythmic beat of my own unharmed heart, I realized the absolute truth. Gravity always wins. The fall hadn't ended on that soundstage. It had just moved inside me, and I was going to be falling for the rest of my life. I turned the key. The engine sputtered, then caught. I put the car in drive, pulled out of the luxury rehab center, and merged onto the Pacific Coast Highway, driving away on two perfectly functional, deeply rotten legs. Would you have told the truth, or would you have stayed quiet to keep your second chance? It's easy to judge Chloe, but survival makes monsters out of all of us when the stakes are high enough. The scariest part of revenge isn't the act itself. It's the silence you have to live in afterward. If this dark, gritty take on karma kept you hooked, hit that like button to let me know. Share this video with someone who loves a complex, messy anti-hero. And don't forget to subscribe for more grounded psychological thrillers. See you in the next one.